Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Against the Odds. So last week on our Against Odds poll, it was Lupine Prototype coming in first in a pretty tight voting. A quick note on the voting: no voting this week, doing a sort of special episode. There's one more Eldritch Moon card I really want to play, so I'm just going to take over, play the card I want to play next week, and then we're going to get back to normal with our polls. Mixture of formats and sets, not all Eldritch Moon anymore. Anyway, this week, we're playing some Lupine Prototype. A quick reminder before we break it down: if you enjoy Against the Odds and this Lupine Prototype deck, it would be awesome if you could comment, like, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff is great ways to support the site for free. Anyway, let's talk about this deck. So, Lupine Prototype is a really weird card to build around. So, on one hand, it is super above the curve. It's a 5/5 for 2 mana. Colorless mana, so you can play in any deck. Problem is, it can't attack or block unless a player has no cards in hand. So my initial thought with Lupine Prototype was to play a Madness deck. I actually made a Madness deck with Lupine Prototype in an article. I tried playing that deck, or a similar deck, not exactly that deck, but with Arms of the Vein and Fiery Impulse and all these, like, cheap vampires to discard things and get empty-handed, and I just couldn't make it work. So I audibled to a second build of Lupine Prototype, and hopefully this one is a little bit better. So the idea of this deck is to play a Lupine Prototype, and the most powerful thing we can do with Lupine Prototype doesn't actually require it to be able to attack or block. The best thing we can do is Prototype on turn 2 into Tormented Thoughts on turn 3. So Tormented Thoughts, you have to sack a creature and pay 3 mana, but then target player has to discard cards equal to the power of the sacrificed creature. So if we Lupine Prototype on turn 2, we have a 5-powered creature. On turn 3, we Tormented Thoughts. Depending on if we're on the play or the draw and so forth, we should be able to get our opponent down to 1 card, 0 cards, 2 cards in the worst case scenario, with them only having maybe 2 or 3 lands on the battlefield. So ideally, this will be a game-winning play. Ideally, we will hit our opponent's resources so hard by sacking our Lupine Prototype that they just won't be able to recover, and we can kill them before they have a chance to kind of rebuild their resources, get cards in their hand, play lands, all that stuff. The other nice thing is that gets a lot of cards out of our opponent's hand, so theoretically, if we sack our first Lupine Prototype to Tormented Thoughts, future Lupine Prototypes will hopefully be able to attack, especially since we're playing a bunch of other discard. So this kind of serves 2 purposes. For one thing, after we Tormented Thoughts with our Lupine Prototype, we can use these cards to kind of clean up whatever is left over. On the other hand, if we don't actually Tormented Thoughts on turn 3, we can kind of just attack our opponent's hand, and these cards work both ways. So on one hand, they are disrupting our opponent and emptying their hand, and if we can get our opponent empty-handed, we can start attacking with Lupine Prototype, and if we get to start attacking with Lupine Prototype in the early game, it is pretty above the curve and has a chance to win a lot of games. One of the great things about Lupine Prototype is it dodges Languish, it dodges Grasp of Darkness, it dodges Ultimate Price, so a lot of the common removal in Standard doesn't actually hit it. So if we can turn on the attacking mode quickly enough, it can maybe win us some games. So if these cards help us get our opponent empty-handed, but also they're cheap cards that we can get out of our hand, so in theory, we can empty our own hand and turn on Lupine Prototype that way. And that's actually the more guaranteed way to do it, because the problem with trying to keep our opponent empty-handed is Lupine Prototype, if our opponent wants it to be, can only be an offensive threat, because we Mind Rot them, get our opponent to 0 cards, we can attack with Lupine Prototype, but then our opponent draws a card, and if they don't want us to block, they can just hold on to that card, so it makes it kind of risky. On the other hand, if we get ourselves empty-handed, then we are free to attack or block with Lupine Prototype. So Collective Brutality kind of works both ways. Not only can it make our opponent discard a card, it's almost a duress in one mode, but it kills something, can drain, gain us a bit of life, so it does a lot of things, but most importantly, it can allow us to discard up to 2 cards, pretty much at any time. So this is a way that we can get ourselves empty-handed to turn on our Lupine Prototype for attacking and blocking. And then we have some removal. we need to clear the way for our Lupine Prototype. So just getting our opponent empty-handed isn't necessarily good enough if our opponent has a bunch of blockers around, because they can just double block our Lupine Prototype with a couple of things. In the late game, it can get outclassed by various Eldrazi, things like that. So we do want to be able to actually kill things. Grasp of Darkness, Ruinous Path has the benefit of hitting Planeswalkers. Languish, like I said, kind of some nice synergy because it won't kill our own Lupine Prototypes, but it will kill, hopefully, most of our opponent's stuff. And then a single Remorseless Punishment. The idea with this one is, since we're making our opponent discard so many cards, they won't have the option to discard 2 cards. So if we can make sure that it's always target opponent loses 5 or 10 life, or sacks 2 creatures or planeswalkers, some combination of those effects, it's actually pretty good. Where it's bad is when the opponent's just like, okay, discard 2 lands. Although, in our deck, why it's really overcosted as a discard 2, if it's getting our opponent empty-handed and letting our prototypes attack, I guess it's not the absolute worst, but it's just kind of a one-of in case we run into situations where it's good. And then we have a couple other creatures. So I mentioned the first build of Lupine Prototype that I had was kind of this aggressive madness build, and one of the problems I had with that build is we would get the Tormented Thoughts combo. Lupine Prototype, Tormented Thoughts. Our opponent discards all their cards. They have like 2 lands on the battlefield, a card or 2 in hand, they're not doing anything, and we didn't have a good way of punishing our opponent for that. They would, we would play a 2/1 vampire or something, our opponent could Fire Impulse it or kill it some way, and we just didn't have enough pressure, so Pitiless Horde is really above the curve for its cost as a 5/3 for only 3 mana, and it has the added benefit that we can dash it in if we draw it off the top for kind of the surprise damage in the late game. So this is just a really above the curve threat that we can play following up our Tormented Thoughts to hopefully close out the game quickly while our opponent doesn't have many resources. Also, it works well with Lupine Prototypes. If we get empty-handed, they hit in good increments of damage. So Lupine Prototype hits for 5, Pitiless Horde hits for 5, 5 and 5 is 10, 10 and 10 is 20, that's our opponent's whole life total. So basically we got to get in 4 attacks with our Pitiless Horde and or Lupine Prototype to win the game. And then Asylum Visitor just takes advantage of the empty-handed aspect of things. We get our opponent empty-handed, we draw on their upkeep. If we're empty-handed, we get to draw on our upkeep, so we're drawing extra cards, finding more removal, prototypes, Pitiless Hordes, discard to get rid of any cards our opponent might have left over in their hand. And it has Madness, which is kind of nice. We don't normally Madness it, but there's a couple of ways that we sometimes Madness it. There are actually situations where I could imagine mind rotting ourselves to get empty-handed for Lupine Prototype, and if we have an Asylum Visitor, kind of added benefit if we have to go that direction. And then as far as the mana base, Blighted Fence, just a kind of a free roll. Since we're mono black, we have 20 black sources. We can afford to play some amount of colorless lands. Blighted Fen is a decent one. It kills an Emrakul, kills a blocker that would get in the way of our prototypes. Gyro Reach Sanitarium is also really sweet in this deck. When both players are looting, it's kind of okay. You got to think about whether the loot benefits you or your opponent more. But if your opponent's empty-handed, it's kind of a free roll because they just draw a card and immediately discard it. So unless they randomly hit a Madness card, they get no benefit from the looting, while we actually get a benefit as long as we have a card in our hand. So in a deck that's designed to get an opponent empty-handed, Gyro Reach Sanitarium is even better than other decks. As far as the sideboard, we got a couple more Duresses for discard. We have a bunch more removal of various types, so an Ultimate Price, a Grasp of Darkness for the early game to hit Tireless Trackers, Sylvan Advocates, humans, Flaying Tendrils, especially for like human type decks that are going wide with a bunch of little creatures, Languish, similar situations. And then we have Infinite Obliterations for Elder Deep Fiends, Emrakuls, those kind of decks and cards that are looking to win with 1 or 2 big threats, often chaining them together. And then some Planeswalkers for more controlling matchups. And then more Remorseless Punishments. The idea here was that they'd be good against like black-white control, Esper Super Friends, decks like that that don't have many creatures. We can get them empty-handed. It's another way to deal with Planeswalkers. So if we're getting like Kalitas and a Liliana with our Remorseless Punishment, it's absolutely insane. So the idea is we can use those in certain controlling matchups where they would potentially be really good. Anyway, that is our Against the Odds Lupine Prototype deck. As far as how good this is, I don't know. I'm hoping that we get the Tormented Thoughts combo quite often. I think that's our way of winning most games. If we can Lupine Prototype into Tormented Thoughts, make our opponent discard 5, those are the games we should have a decent chance of winning. On the other hand, one of the problems is discard gets worse as the game goes along. Once we get our opponent empty-handed, every time we draw a Mind Rot or a Tormented Thoughts or a Duress or Transgressive Mind, it's basically a mulligan. It's a misdraw. It's like we didn't even draw that card if our opponent's already empty-handed. So that's one of the downsides, is the diminishing returns of discard, and I'm afraid that's going to be an issue with our deck. So we got to try to close out the game quickly once we get our opponent empty-handed, and we'll see if Lupine Prototype and Pitiless Horde are good enough to pull that off. Asylum Visitor does help a little bit because it allows us to draw through some of those meaningless discard spells. But, so I don't know, I'm going to say we win, let's say, about 25% of the time, 1 out of every 4 games. I don't know if there's any specific matchup. I think we want to play against controlling slow decks where our discard can really shine. If people are trying to dirtle around and play Emeralds and Obnixilis and expensive things, then our discard's going to be awesome. On the other hand, I'm a little worried against aggressive decks because I think we're just going to get run over a lot of the time. We're just pretty much crossing our fingers, hoping we draw into Languish. If we do, we have some chance of winning. If we don't, our Prototype can't block a lot of the time. Pitiless Horde isn't really a great blocker. It's much better on offense. Asylum Visitor. So we're kind of just leaning really heavily on drawing Languish. Whether or not we draw it, we'll have to wait and see. So hopefully we run into slower controlling decks and dodge some of the more aggressive decks in the format. Anyway, that's been our Lupine Prototype deck. Thank you very much for watching. Enjoy the gameplay videos, and I will talk to you soon.